Let me introduce our panel today. So I have Cohen Lamberts, who's just to my left here, who's the Vice-Chancellor of University of York. Nicola Dandridge, who's the Director of Universities UK. We have Ian Diamond, Principal of Aberdeen University, and David Willits, who I'm sure all of you know now, Chair of the Resolution Foundation, and probably half a dozen other things as well, former Higher Education Minister and Science Minister for many years. So the subject we have before us in terms of what happens post-Brexit or in the course of Brexit is student and faculty mobility. There's a number of issues associated with both of those. Student mobility, I mean, it isn't perhaps the most gripping of titles, but student mobility, I think, is two things really. It could be international students coming to the UK, but we generally take it to mean students who are studying here, spending some time abroad during their studies, either studying or perhaps working or indeed sometimes volunteering as part of their studies. And in that respect, the Erasmus, what is now the Erasmus Plus program, which has been running for over 20 years in the EU, is one of the matters of interest. And of course, as far as staff is concerned, they also have periods of mobility, either UK staff spending time abroad, and in this particular case in the European Union, or your staff from mainland, or as we're colleagues from mainland Europe who come and spend time in this country or work here permanently or for periods of time. So there's lots of aspects to all of this, and the questions are going to be, how do we maintain the advantages of those mobilities? So I'm going to ask each panel member to talk for up to 5 minutes, and then we will move to an open discussion. So we'll just do it in the order we have, I think. If you want to start, Cohen. Sorry, you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'll keep this one because I'm in charge.
Thank you very much, Colin. So I was asked to talk for 5 minutes about the opportunities that lie ahead of us, and I will split that up, as Colin suggested, in opportunities around students and student mobility and student recruitment, and opportunities around academic staff in particular. As far as students are concerned, the UK's higher education brand is, of course, very strong. We have a genuinely strong global reputation. The fundamentals of the sector are very, very good. So it's really crucial that the perception of the UK sector globally must remain very positive. So we try to contribute to that by continuing to send very strong, very clear, positive messages about our attitudes, about our autonomy, about our academic quality, the way in which we value academic freedom, about our international and very open outlook, and about the diversity of the sector and the value of money, the value for money that we have to offer. So that positive messaging and creating that strong positive brand, even more than it exists today, is really a priority for many universities, I think. There are also specific opportunities around student mobility. There is, for instance, the opportunity to target new EU student cohorts, in the sense that most universities, and York is no exception, attract significant numbers of EU students, but there are also many EU students who are very happy to pay very high fees sometimes to study in the US, in Canada, in Australia, and other competitor nations. And I think we should target them as well and encourage them in a post-Brexit environment to consider the UK instead, and exploit our very strong reputation to make that happen. So it is really targeting a new EU student market to replace some of the market that we might lose, as students will no longer probably have access to loans. There are opportunities to open and strengthen, of course, other global markets. There's the opportunity to create a student visa system that is welcoming, that lowers the threshold for students, and yet provides guarantees and controls that the government will, of course, expect. We have to remember, in establishing that, of course, that UK higher education represents a global export market, which is worth more than 20 billion to the British economy. around outgoing student mobility, which is important. It's important that we go beyond EU schemes and explore generally global schemes for supporting students' international experience, because we know that students that have an international experience have enhanced employment prospects and also tend to perform better academically. So, for instance, at York, we've established global study centers, as we call them, in countries as diverse as Brazil, China, United States, South Africa. And so I think there's certainly an opportunity to broaden that engagement even further. In terms of staff, our strong reputation, of course, allows us to recruit the best people from all over the world. Top academics are attracted by opportunities for funding, for other support, by academic quality and reputation, but ultimately also about access they have through their location to networks mostly for research. And these networks are almost invariably international. So there is an opportunity, I think, to create a funding and support environment that is truly welcoming to that incoming global talent. And as we may no longer be, although we don't know what the new arrangement will be, but as we may no longer be a member of the Common European Research Area, we have to think of ways in which we can engage with European networks under a novel kind of arrangement. There must be opportunities to open up that engagement and to seek to support networks all over the world. And we need to think about agreements, and these could be bilateral agreements, they could be multilateral agreements for funding and for providing support in other ways for those generally global networks. So again, there is here a major opportunity and an incentive for innovation. So these are just two examples I wanted to highlight. My broad conclusion would be that universities have in the past demonstrated that they have tremendous adaptive capacity. If you compare the sector and what it looks like now to the way in which it existed only 6 or 7 years ago, it's completely transformed itself. And universities have been able to adapt because we have great autonomy, we have great flexibility, and that's a genuine strength of the UK higher education system. So we have the resilience to adapt to the changes that we face. And most importantly, the change on the scale that we face is going to bring innovation, and it's going to require innovation. And I think that is something that in the sector will come to be seen as of course, a significant challenge, but also as ultimately a great opportunity. So thank you.
Thanks, Cohen. I've realised I forgot to say that I'm not Steve Smith, as billed on the programme. I'm Colin Reardon, Vice-Chancellor of Cardiff University. Steve's not able to be with us, as it happens. Nicola.
Thank you, Colin. I want to start by making a point which is well understood, or at least well assumed within the higher education sector, but perhaps isn't so well understood externally, and that's the fact that at the heart of a successful higher education sector is an international approach. There's a really strong correlation between an international engagement and those universities that are regarded as successful. And that manifests itself in all sorts of ways. We know that there is a strong correlation between international research collaboration and international excellence. And I think a good indicator of this is the fact that the very powerful global rankings of universities have a number of metrics which do measure number of international staff and international students, as if that in itself is an indicator of excellence. So we start from a position of knowing that there is this really strong connection between an international engagement and success. That will take many forms within universities. It's as much a cultural thing as anything else, but it also has a more granular implications in terms of just the sheer number of international staff and students that work within universities. 45% of research staff are non-UK within universities. And 28% of all staff overall, and about 19% of all students. These are very high proportions, and as I say, that isn't a coincidence. It is tied to the mission and success of universities. So for many of us, I think one of the main concerns about Brexit was whether or not it was going to be symptomatic of a retreat from from the country's international identity, which would then knock on to universities' international engagement. I think it's very clear that that's not what anyone really wants. It's not what the government wants. It's certainly not what UK higher education wants. And I think the comments that have been made by various government ministers really emphasising that there's a desire to retain the ability to attract the best in global talent that was reiterated in the government's white paper this January on exiting the UK, which emphasised on a number of occasions the desire to remain open to international talent is something that I think we should not only draw considerable comfort from, but that we should be emphasising and ensuring that it is part of the future, not just for universities, but for the country. What I wanted to do in probably the 2 minutes that are left to me is just touch on a few headline issues that I think are going to be absolutely critical to ensure that universities can flourish and thrive in post-Brexit Britain. And that's not with a view to that being an end in itself. It's with a view to the universities then being able to play the role that they do play in supporting individual graduate transformation of their individual experiences, economic growth, social cohesion, and so on. So what do we want? Well, I think firstly, critically, we need to get our visa system right. Kern's already mentioned that. Now, of course, staff and student mobility is much wider than a question of visas. It's to do with attitudes and cultures. But nonetheless, I think our visa system is a very granular and specific manifestation of our country's attitude towards immigration. And I think what we have now is an unparalleled opportunity to try and get this right. I think long term in the higher education sector, we are not looking for a distinction between EU and non-EU staff, though there may need to be some sort of transitional arrangements, and also acknowledgement of the priority of the common travel area in Northern Ireland. But I think what we are looking for is a simplified and effective visa system that's less bureaucratic, that works, but doesn't compromise in terms of compliance. And I think we're very clear within the university sector that that's non-negotiable. We have to make sure that we are completely compliant. But against that backdrop, it has to be a system that's simplified and improved. And alongside that, it needs to be communicated in a more effective way. Underpinning it, we need better data. So that's I've mentioned that at some length because I think that's absolutely critical to a future successful, thriving higher education sector. Secondly, an improved focus on outward mobility. This is less of an issue for our staff who are outwardly mobile into the world, but our record for students is really poor. We are not good at getting our students to study abroad. This is a priority for UK, very much led by Colin actually, and we've just published a report which has emphasised the strong correlation between educational and graduate outcomes and outward mobility. It's really compelling, and perhaps most compelling of all is the fact that the most impact is amongst those cohorts who have most difficulties maybe in accessing graduate employment. In other words, students from disadvantaged backgrounds and black and minority ethnic students have most to gain from outward mobility. So the second point I'd like to emphasise is we need to embrace the opportunity for enhancing outward mobility. Thirdly, consistency in political messaging, and I mean a political with a small p there, in terms of our international engagement and our commitment to working with colleagues from across the world. And that consistency must spread beyond HE into government, between the different government departments, into anyone who is communicating internationally. I think at the moment our UK message is sometimes confused, and we could do an awful lot better. And again, we have the opportunity to do that. Fourthly, we cannot view these opportunities in isolation from the networks which potentially we stand to lose by leaving Europe. And I say potentially because that's very much up for negotiation at the moment. But there are critically important networks for universities in terms of research collaborations that we do need to maintain or substitute. And I think we can't talk about immigration without thinking about how we can either replace or reinforce or protect and preserve those networks. And then finally, and maybe in a slightly utopian mode, what I would hope we can see from all of this is the creation of a better space where, as a country and a sector, we can discuss what a responsible immigration system looks like, an evidence-based discussion that acknowledges the anxieties that have been expressed in part by the Brexit vote, but more generally for many years, and yet acknowledges that we are fundamentally an internationally engaged country, and that internationalism is essential to the success of universities, not only, as I say, as a means, as an end, but as a means to enabling universities to contribute to a thriving post-Brexit United Kingdom.
Thanks, Nicola. Ian Diamond.
Thank you very much. Can I just start with just a straight statement of fact? The UK higher education system is totally outstanding on any international criterion. And it's peopled by an academic community which is completely global, a global labour force, but which is totally committed to having a serious impact on the economy, on the health and on the social cohesion of the UK. It's also peopled by a global student community, which internationally is attracted to the UK by its reputation, the quality of the higher education it's provided, and which subsequently provides a labour force for the UK or goes back to the country or some other country and provides immense soft power over a long period of time. And the fact that we have a global student community is unbelievably good for our local community. The fact that 21% of the undergraduates at the University of Aberdeen are from Europe is incredibly good for students from Turriff and Afford and Aboyne and Aberdeen itself, as well as for those students itself, because we live in an environment where, as much as Nicola has said, internationalisation is important as possible. First point. But let's be absolutely clear. It wasn't always like this, and it doesn't have to remain like this. Let me just look at some of the things that have happened that have helped. I'm not just saying this because David is sitting next to me, but the removal of the cap in England and the fact that we are able to recruit as many students as possible who are able to be funded properly using income contingent loans is an enormous plus for UK higher education. The long-term commitment to the funding of research in difficult financial times under David's government, but even more so recently, is a fundamental criterion. The fact that we were able to be in the European Research Council, which overcame some of the double jeopardies and triple jeopardies that I observed and started to do something about when I was at the Economic and Social Research Council, is important. The fact that we do have, and I know we're not as good as we should in students getting out and about, but we have attractive policies increasingly for mobility outward, attractive targets for mobility outward. And finally, we have Erasmus, but let me be very, very clear. Erasmus is not student mobility. It's a scheme which is part of student mobility. It is not student mobility. Now, all those things I've just described have happened. They need to continue to happen if we are to get to the post-Brexit world that I would like to see. And so let me just now outline some of the areas that I think are incredibly important. We need to get a perception globally that we are an attractive place for students and staff to come to. Prime Minister in a speech on 17th of January said, we want to make the UK an attractive place for genuine students to come. That's absolutely the right thing to say, but just at the moment, in many areas of the world, that's not quite seen the way. And we need to really think through how we make the UK attractive, and part of that will be policies. What sort of policies? We need flexibility on fees. That's a technical point, but it is incredibly important that post-Brexit, universities are completely free to charge whatever they like for students from wherever they come from. Secondly, we need post-study work visas. That's incredibly important. And we need post-study work visas which are easy to access and easy to use. We need to continue relatively small funding streams, but relatively small funding streams which promote outward mobility. While I absolutely agree with Cohen about the European Research Council, let's be braver. Let's engage right across the world and have, as much as we can, a global research area. In a naive moment in 2003, I just sent a letter to 30-odd different research council heads and said, why don't we have a bilateral agreement? And a number of them wrote back, and we did. It wasn't that hard, but it required total commitment then from my colleagues to make this happen. We need easy access to work visas for bona fide academics working at a high level. We've got history. You know, just a couple of years ago, all the Royal Academies and Royal Society said they were prepared to, if you like, very quickly vet. Are these people really eminent? Yep, absolutely no problem. It can be done pretty quickly. And finally, we need a focus in the industrial strategy. And let me say, I really like the industrial strategy, but we need a focus in the industrial strategy on higher education and innovation as a driver for local economies and a driver for the economy as a whole. We really work on those features, we can absolutely get a world that I think will be the one we want.
Thanks very much, Ian. David.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. We've an extraordinary achievement here. We've got a relatively small audience, but we've got 2 Paul Marshalls in it. And it's great to have both the UPP Paul Marshall and the creator of this event, I think it's fair to say, Sir Paul Marshall as well. So two Paul Marshalls in a small group. What are the chances of that? We've already heard some fantastic comments. I don't need to repeat those, but just some quick observations. First of all, there was a very useful recent HEPI pamphlet which tried to disentangle the economics of all this. And if you assume that we end access to loans for students from Europe, and we end, of course, the control of the fee, which Ian was just referring to, you might expect to see a reduction in the number of EU students coming to study in Britain, but they will probably be charged themselves a higher fee. So the reduction in numbers won't feed through one-to-one in a loss of revenue, and there's some interesting questions about price sensitivity. And because prospect of Brexit has already led to a fall in the pound, it's meant that the cost, if you're an overseas student who coming to study in Britain, has fallen. So there seems to be some, we would expect to have some positive impact on demand from the devaluation of the pound. Put all those things together, and there are a range of scenarios, including a scenario in which there are fewer overseas students but greater total revenues from them. So nobody can quite know how it's going to pan out and what the sensitivities are. For me, having been involved in this debate over the years, let me get off my chest some frustrations about the way it has been conducted. First of all, the language of the brightest and best is a very confusing way of thinking about student and indeed even, though it's more relevant here, academic mobility. People who come here to study should be suitably qualified to benefit from a higher education in Britain, and then we would expect them, usually, to go back home. We are thinking of them as having to be the brightest and best is to apply a migration mentality to what is actually the sale of a service as a source of export revenues. We don't say we're only going to sell the cars produced in our motor factories to the brightest and best advanced drivers, and we don't say we're only going to sell Bentleys and we're not going to demean ourselves by selling them Minis, provided that they are able to buy the product, and that's fine. Provided they're able properly to benefit from higher education and can pay for it, and afterwards they leave. The brightest and best model is a very confusing and dangerous model. And it's matched by another model, which is they should only be coming to, quote, the best universities. And there are all these stories around that they should be allowed to come and study at the Russell Group, but they shouldn't be allowed to come and study at other universities. That's another very dangerous model. The fact is that we're fortunate in having a diverse higher education sector with a range of different universities, with a range of distinctive missions. And if you want to come to Britain to study and be trained as a nurse, or to do automotive engineering, it might be the case that going to a Russell Group university is not the best place for that. You might want to go to a university that's got a strong tradition in a nursing school, or a university that's got strong links to the automotive industry, and you'd find yourself looking at Coventry or Teesside or whatever. The idea that you should only be coming if you're coming to study to Russell Group University is, again, to misunderstand the range and the diversity of our higher education offer. Something else that frustrates me a bit is the focus on Erasmus. And if you're a government minister thinking about how you approach the negotiations, the fact is that Erasmus, to put it brutally, has not been a brilliant deal for Britain. It is supposed to be an exchange programme, but it isn't an exchange programme. Actually, we have many more students coming into Britain on Erasmus programs than we have going to study overseas on Erasmus, and we are not allowed to charge them any kind of fee when they're here. Indeed, the funding of the education of those is largely a cost borne by our universities. So Erasmus is not a particularly good deal for the UK. Student mobility in and out is a great thing. We don't need to be preoccupied, as Ian said, by seeing it through the prism of Erasmus. I agree with what Nicola and Ian both said about encouraging more students to go overseas. And my frustration at the way in which the debate is treated as being about the brightest and best is only matched by the way in which there are still newspaper stories where a student going to study abroad is treated as tantamount to a brain drain and a terrible loss for Britain. We actually don't have enough British students studying abroad. 500,000 students coming in from overseas and 30,000 British students going abroad is a ludicrous imbalance. We should have more British students benefiting from the experience of studying abroad, and I would extend entitlement to fee loans to British students going to study abroad. And I think it'd be really useful for Greg and Joe, my successors, to have in their back pocket when they are negotiating these doing these trade deals with Liam Fox as well and others, to be able to turn up, and one of the offers they say is, we're going to extend student loans to British students who come to study in your country. That's part of the offer we're putting on the table as part of good relations with you. So I think it makes sense for our students, and it's a great offer to have in trade negotiations. Finally, I think in the industrial strategy document, there is a bit of a flavour of STEM as the crucial educational challenge. Now, it's very important that people have STEM skills, and I see sitting here Shirley Conran, who's done fantastic work to encourage women, girls in particular, to stick with maths, because that is so important. But when you look at the range of skills that are required for the future, it is not just STEM skills. And if I were thinking of what Britain needs to do more of, if it's going to be more global and more effective at exporting, very high on my list would be more foreign languages. I think our performance in foreign languages has been abysmal. To some extent, the fact that the EU has become a largely English-speaking area and the elite in different companies and national capitals will all speak English, and it's becoming the lingua franca of the EU, has enabled us to get away with being lazy. But if you think of these kind of target markets that are we're always being told about, and China and Brazil and Mexico, the idea that you can turn up in those countries and do serious business without people having made the effort of learning at least to have some grasp of Mandarin, learning and speaking Spanish. To be honest, in Brazil increasingly, you've got to be able to have some Portuguese. If you can't do that, we are not going to have much hope of getting global. And so foreign language skills, I think, should be up there alongside STEM skills, as well as a wider understanding of the history and cultures of these countries. And the humanities, and I love the humanities, I benefited from an education in the humanities. One of my frustrations, there's often a bit of a victim complex in the humanities, a bit of defensiveness in the humanities. The humanities have got a crucial role here if we are to indeed live up to our ambitions for being a global Britain, and they should see this as a fantastic opportunity to make the case for a broader education for students, both British students in British universities and studying overseas. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, David. And I think we'll move straight to questions from the audience because we have quite tight time control. So we've got Rob, then Paul. Oh yes, do you need one of these? Okay, we're going to have to do a lot of running and back and forth. We need the microphones so that the voices are actually picked up. It's not just the amplification within the room.
Thanks, Colin. Robert Lyons here, British Council. You all talked about the importance of outward mobility and one or two examples. But can you think, what more do we need to do? I mean, 30,000 students going overseas to study is a paltry number compared to the number of students here. What do we need to do to really up that? And I'd welcome each of you to come up with one big idea.
Any ideas then? If we bring the microphone back again so that our panel... Oh, shall I just pass this one round? Yeah, it might be easier. Okay, Ian?
Fundamentally, when we talk to our students about why they don't go, it is largely about it is going to impact on the quality of the degree that I get, and therefore I will not get as good a job afterwards as I want. So there's the problem. What's the solution? Twofold, I would argue. One is that we don't count. This is one thing we're doing. We don't count the semester abroad as part of your final marks. You've got to pass it, but we won't count it towards your first 2-1 or whatever. Secondly, we work increasingly with partners across the world so that we do start to get, to David's point, actually real exchanges. So that you're studying economics at the University of Aberdeen, you know that if you go to Duisburg-Essen, you're actually going to study economics as it pretty much looked like at Aberdeen, and therefore you will not be impacted upon. So those two things are the solutions that we found to the problem that we found.
I think there are two things in which we can support it. One is financial. It's still, in many cases, expensive to go abroad and to spend time. So we have to make sure that financial support packages that we offer as universities, that they really do help to encourage students from more challenged socioeconomic backgrounds to take part in exchange as well. The second is language support. Particularly if students go to countries where teaching in English is limited, the ability to speak the local language is actually quite crucial. And in York, for instance, we've started to link our free language provision for students to outward mobility. So if students are planning to go abroad for a term or 2 terms, then they will have access to free language support so they can at least get some preparation in the language of the country they're going to visit.
A very small final point. I totally agreeing with what Ian kind of said. There's one other thing that if we're particularly interested in encouraging students from disadvantaged backgrounds to participate in outward mobility schemes, then I think we've got to be realistic about the likelihood of their taking a whole year out. And so alongside year-long programs, I think we need to be more modest about developing ones that are for 3 months or even for some just a few weeks, either as standalone or as a prelude to something more ambitious in the future.
Yes, there's good evidence to say that even 2 weeks makes a difference. And one problem with Erasmus is it's quite inflexible. It's got to be at least 3 months. So, Paul.
It's a question relating to Ian Diamond's 6th point about the importance of universities to their local economy and understanding that in our industrial strategy. And it was a question I was going to ask in the IP section as well, actually. We've heard about things like Oxford Science Initiative, and it's very easy to see how Oxbridge and the London universities can and are already integrating well with the local economy and being able to really take advantage of their IP. But when it comes to universities like Aberdeen, York, Newcastle, Cardiff, it presumably is quite a lot more difficult. And do you think government has a role to play, or can it happen naturally through the market?
Sometimes it can happen naturally through the market, but let me just give you a concrete example. Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire have a city deal, which I was very much part of putting together, which has innovation at the heart and which has industry-led parts to it in oil and gas, with an oil and gas technology centre, in food and drink, another area where we have real strength in the local universities, and in life sciences. So there's 3 areas absolutely supported by government now working very hard to drive innovation for a post-oil Aberdeen economy. It can absolutely be done. It can't happen overnight, but it needs focus, and it needs to be, I would argue, built around the strengths of those local institutions. So what happens in York or in Cardiff will be very different to the strengths that already existed in the University of Aberdeen, but you can build on them and drive local economies in that way.
But is there a specific role for government?
Well, there was. In this case, the pump priming came from government through a city deal. And I'm a huge fan of city deals because they're a loan and one has to report against them. And the government, if you like, said, we will support the development of this innovation-led industry to drive the economy. That's a real role for government. And I think the industrial strategy has other roles to play. Some of them, for example, around things like HS2 and things like that. So the government, it seems to me, has an enormous role to play, but it isn't a one-size-fits-all role.
Government has another role, which is, oddly enough, a kind of a negative role of getting out of a serious misconception. And although Richard Lambert is a great man, some of the Lambert agenda on IP and startups has led people to be absolutely preoccupied with the number of university startups, the number of patents, the protection of IP, the nightmare scenario for a vice-chancellor that some IP that is developed in this university will end up proving to be incredibly valuable, and people will come back at me, why do we own 5% of it or 1% of it? So there's an awful lot of effort that now goes into complicated negotiations for universities to own 10% or 20% of the IP of something which, to be honest, is never going to be worth much, whose early value is really quite modest, and the value will all come from subsequent development and investment, and a belief that counting these mini projects, many of which never become viable and are kept in a kind of half-life limbo for year after year, as these are the SMEs we are spinning off from this university, to be honest, there's an awful lot of waste. Britain actually has more university startups and spin-outs per $1 million of spending than the America does. We've actually, if anything, we have got too many. Government should stop counting the numbers of the value of the number of these startups and spin-outs, and it should make it clear that the value from these entities comes from their long-term commercial activity in the UK, not a university extracting X £100,000 out of a piece of IP if by any happy accident in 20 years' time it's worth a lot of money. Easing up on the pressures to do that would change the culture in tech transfer offices, which are too preoccupied with pinning down these often relatively modest bits of potential value.
I completely agree. Give the IP away.
So I'm afraid we have a red light at the back there, which means I can't take any more questions, and it only remains for me to thank the panel and ask you to join me in doing that. Thank you very much, everybody.